Hello everyone, thank you for your interest in this first webinar organized by EMVO. This webinar marks the beginning of a series of remote trainings and workshops, which will aim to provide you with useful and constructive information on a diverse set of topics related to the EMVS. The first webinar consists of a training focusing on the EU FMD designated wholesaler, during which you will learn more about the concept of a designated wholesaler, its importance, the impact on the data quality and alerts, and how to manage it. I would like to give the word now to Grant Courtney, an independent consultant who will guide you through the webinar. We hope you find it informative, and in case of questions, please don't hesitate to contact our help desk, which remains always at your disposal. Enjoy.
Thank you very much. So, hello everybody, you're listening to Grant Courtney. First, I'd like to start with a disclaimer. In putting together these materials, we've done our best to consult with legal advisors, other industry stakeholders, but we would stress that we take no accountability for these materials, and it is always down to your own organisations to interpret the legislation and your accountability for complying with the legislation. So this is a quick look at the agenda, what we're going to cover today. We'll give you the objectives of the training, a little background to the EU FMD, the importance of this particular area, how this area impacts on your master data, and perhaps a little look at how to manage your master data results of this. We're then going to do a deep dive into designated wholesalers, to look at exactly what they are and who can be one. And then quite importantly, we're going to walk you through some of what we suggest are next steps that your organisation takes in this area. And then we'll just finish by a full circle coming back, reviewing those objectives and making sure that we've covered everything. So the objectives of this session. The first thing I should say is that we're going to be looking at the concept of designated wholesaler, but throughout this presentation, we sometimes use DW as a shortened way of writing designated wholesaler. It's not used within a legal framework, it's just to keep the slides succinct. So the training material has been developed to provide the onboarding partners with a more comprehensive understanding of what a DW actually is, why it's important, and what you should do about it. So by the end of this training, you should be able to answer these questions. What is a designated wholesaler? Why are they needed? How do they impact you? And what do you do next? So let's look into the background of this a little. The first thing that it's probably worth noting is the difference between a track and trace model and a point of dispense verification model. So the EU does not track and trace products through each node of the supply chain, like you would with the track and trace model. Instead, it introduces more of a risk-based approach to verification. Now, if you're going to run a risk-based approach, the next question quite clearly is, well then, how do you know when to carry out a verification? What constitutes risk? Do you scan and verify within the supply chain? So in order to answer that question, we have to look at Article 20 of the delegated regulation, and I've quoted that verbatim below. So a wholesaler shall verify the authenticity of the unique identifier of at least the following. One is on medicinal products being returned, and that's fairly simple. But the next one is the confusing one. Medical products he receives from a wholesaler who is neither the manufacturer nor the wholesaler holding the market authorization, nor a wholesaler who is designated by the marketing authorization holder. Okay, so what does that all mean? Let's take a look. So this is a very simple supply chain, and we're going to pretend for a moment that we are wholesaler number 3. What we have here is a product return from a pharmacy or a hospital coming into wholesaler number 3. Or we've got a product return from a pharmacy or wholesaler going back to wholesaler number 2. And you can see that all of these flows are impacted by A, additional products returned to him by persons authorised or entitled to supply medicinal products to the public or by another wholesaler. So these folks here are the first part of that sentence. And because these goods have been supplied to a wholesaler and then returned to another wholesaler, that's the second part, or by another wholesaler. So according to Article 20, wholesaler number 3 would have to verify the unique identifiers on the products that they are receiving in both these instances. Let's look at the second part of this. So we have a manufacturer here that has a designated wholesaler in place. That means when the goods go to this wholesaler, number 2, they don't need to be verified because this wholesaler is receiving them from a designated wholesaler. However, when this wholesaler supplies the goods to wholesaler number 3, they do need to be verified because according to B, it says that the medicinal products he receives from a wholesaler who is neither the manufacturer, wholesaler 2 is not the manufacturer, nor the wholesaler holding the marketing authorization, nor a wholesaler who is designated, or they're not designated, and therefore wholesaler 3 would need to verify goods received from wholesaler 2. So that's a lot to take in, but fundamentally that's the breakdown. And you can see now it's very important for wholesaler 3 to understand who is designated in order to be able to carry out that risk-based verification. So why is this all important? And specifically, why is it important to the market authorization holder? Well, the first thing is if your wholesalers, which you have contracts in place with, written contracts to be a designated wholesaler, store and distribute products, if they're not identified, then when the designated wholesaler moves those products to a wholesaler number 2, then that wholesaler number 2 would have to verify the products that they receive from the designated wholesaler. And that is completely unnecessary. This drives cost into the supply chain and may impact lead times due to additional processing. It could also put your supply chain at an unnecessary disadvantage because now your goods that you're manufacturing are not flowing through the supply chain as fast as perhaps competitors. So it's really vital as an MAH, you're declaring your designated to wholesalers so that there's not unnecessary verification going on, unnecessary risk-based verification going on in the supply chain. So why is this important to a wholesaler? What this diagram here is trying to do is show that as a wholesaler, you are receiving hundreds of different products from many different sources every day. And keeping track of what has to be verified is only really practically possible if there is some data to tell you what you're supposed to be doing. And that data is provided by the OBPs as part of the master data. So if you are a wholesaler, you will only know whether you have to verify or not verify based on that data. So we've looked at the impacts for an MAH. Let's just look at the impacts for the wholesalers of missing or incorrect DW data. Of course, the first thing is that there's an increased complexity in the inbound logistic processes. There will be a need to scan every single pack of serialized product. That will cause delays, particularly with high volume verification. It will increase costs due to the scanning efforts, and it could introduce bottlenecks into that inbound area. A knock-on of these types of risks is that then you can get risks of shortages and you get major efficiency losses. And I don't need to tell anybody in logistics the real impacts back to the MAH of introducing these types of constraints onto the downstream supply chain. So it's really important that the designated wholesalers are set up correctly within your master data. Okay, so we now know a little bit about what a DW is, and we've looked at why they're important. Let's now look at the impact on your data and perhaps how to manage this. If you're not familiar with this diagram, it is the data diagram for the data that sits within the EUFMD system. Now, for every product, we have a set of product master data, such as the product code, for example, a GTIN, the name of the product, the common name, the pharmaceutical form, strength, etc. And for every product, there will be a product per market set of data. So if you send the product to 3 countries, then there will be 3 of these tables for every one of the product master data. And you can see at the bottom of the product per market, list of wholesalers, ID, name and address. That is where you put the DW information. But let's be really clear, it's at the granularity of a market per product. So we now know where the list of your designated wholesalers for a product and market exists. We know that it can be specific to a product and country level. And down here, I've just laid out what needs to go into that field. ID, name, address. You probably won't have an idea at this point. Okay, this is a very busy slide, but let me just break this down for you. You've seen that if you are supplying one product via one designated wholesaler to one country, then your master data is fairly simple. But what if you're supplying 100 products through 40 designated wholesalers to 26 different countries? You can very quickly see that the management of your DW data could become very, very complex. The key purpose of this slide is to say, at what level are you going to manage your DW data? Quite often it helps to group the DW data into different supply chain scenarios. So for example, if you have a set of products going through one designated wholesaler and a different set of products going through another designated wholesaler, but they go to all the same countries, then there's no need to differentiate that data between products. However, if you have different products in different countries and different designated wholesalers, then that task is going to get a lot more complex. So we do know that some OBPs will manage their DW data at sort of a company or a product level. Others do have to break it down into a country level. But think very carefully about the level at which is appropriate for you, because there is an awful lot of work to keeping this data updated. The one thing I also want to point out on this slide is another reason why we've got to get this right. GDP inspections can include assessments to ensure that the designated wholesaler has a written contract in place and covers the relevant activities. And if you go to the GDP guidelines, chapter 1, paragraph 3, etc., you'll see that. So what I'm telling you is that an inspector has the right and will most likely go to a wholesaler operation, and they will check whether they have been designated as a DW, and they will expect to see the agreements and the processes in place required to act like that. So this isn't just about providing information to the downstream partners to know when they have to verify and they don't. It's also to make sure that your partners remain compliant and meet expectations during GDP inspections. So this is GXP data. Okay, so we've looked at what they are, why they're important. We've seen where the data resides, and we've talked a little bit about perhaps grouping your data across products or countries or designated wholesalers to try and simplify the task of management. But we probably haven't spent enough time talking exactly what is a designated wholesaler. How do you identify your designated wholesalers? So before we do that, it's probably worth just taking a slight step back and talk about what we might call pre-wholesaling. So really, this is the activity, the provision of logistical services to pharmaceutical manufacturers. And that usually consists of warehousing and transportation, etc. It's the piece between factory and usually your first commercial customer outside of the sale of your product. So designated wholesalers typically are parties involved in this pre-wholesaling activity for which you have a contract in place to carry out pre-wholesaling activity. Some of the parties that are typically captured within this area are sales affiliates of an MAH. So that's a company focusing on the sales and is controlled by the MAH and is a legal entity. So that's basically the sales office selling the product. It could be a co-marketeer. So that's a company commercializing a product under a different trade name. Some of you might have co-marketing agreements in place. And the other one is co-promoter. And that's a company that's operating under agreement to license and commercialize the same medical products, but under a different trademark. Okay. So let's look at some of those parties. Now, I should make it clear that Article 20 refers to the physical transfer of the product and not the financial flows, okay? So don't get confused by that. Article 20 talks about when the product moves, not when the money moves or it's being sold. But we do show both flows here. So this first, it's a fairly typical example. We've got a market authorization holder, and that market authorization holder has basically a affiliate, a sales office. That could be, let's say, France, for example. So the products are manufactured and they are moved to a pre-wholesaling distributor or third-party logistics provider. This is the organization that is moving and storing the products, as you can see, before the goods are externally sold from the company down to a wholesaler, full-line wholesale. Now, there will be a contract in place between the sales affiliate and this distributor or third-party logistics provider. And that contract must cover the DW aspects. The sales affiliate is determined to be a proxy of the MAH, part of the same company. And it's advised that there should also be some type of contractual arrangement in place that proves that the sales affiliate are acting on behalf of the MAH. So check that's in place and check that there's a contract in place between your sales affiliate and their wholesaler or distributor, and that covers the DW activities. If that's all in place, it means that when the goods are shipped from the pre-wholesaler to the wholesaler, your first wholesaler does not need to carry out verification activities. And it's the pre-wholesaler distributor or 3PL that will be in your master data declared as a designated wholesaler. So hopefully that's fairly clear, and it's probably the simplest of the examples. Let's look at something just slightly more complex. Similar scenario, but in this case, it's not your sales affiliate that is selling the products into the marketplace, it's a co-promoter. Now, a co-promoter is not considered a proxy of the MAH, and therefore it must be listed as a designated wholesaler. They will also have a contract in place with a logistics service provider, and they must also be listed as a designated wholesaler. But a few important things here. Make sure that the contracts are in place between the MAH and the co-promoter, and make sure that the contracts are in place between the co-promoter and the designated wholesaler down here. So that's how co-promotion works. Now we actually add those two scenarios together. So we know about the sales affiliate having a contract perhaps with a third-party logistics provider. That third-party logistics provider might then move to your co-promoter's third-party logistics provider or pre-wholesaler. And as long as there is an agreement between the MAH and sales affiliate, between the MAH and the co-promoter and pre-wholesaler, sales affiliate and 3PL, as long as all those contracts and everything in place, then all three parties can be declared as a DW. Okay, so now we know what designated wholesalers are, and we know how they relate to things like your sales affiliates or co-promotion, etc. Let's look at what you should do as a result of receiving this training. The first thing I would recommend is to document your organization's interpretation of when you allocate a supply chain partner as DW status. Why document that? Because everything you do from that point on will be based on your organization's documented understanding of what a DW is. And then if there's any doubts in future, and some of these supply chain scenarios get quite tricky and quite complex, you can always go through to your organization's documented interpretation. So that's really important, and go and get that signed off by your legal department, by your regulatory organization, your logistics organization, and make sure that you all have a common understanding. Once you've done that, check that you've completed the wholesaler information in your product master data. Perhaps it's not completed at the moment, or perhaps it's partially completed, or it's become out of date. So do check that you've completed the wholesaler information. Confirm that you've captured the correct entities in your wholesaler information and the data is complete. So have you considered things like sales affiliates, co-marketeers, those other stakeholders that we've shown you on the previous slides? If you haven't, then obviously you need to go back and do that. Now, I always say that data, as soon as you've collected data and you've entered it into a system, it starts to rot or decay. So you must have master data maintenance processes in place to keep your wholesaler and actually other master data updated. It's not unusual to launch new products, to change third-party providers, or to enter into new commercial arrangements with co-providers, etc. And any of those will require that your product master data needs to be updated. Or you build these processes into your new product supply, where you have to work out what supply chain is and who the designated wholesalers are for a new product. So do establish those master data maintenance processes. And this is really important now. Ensure that your contracts with your designated wholesalers are in place and cover as a minimum set of responsibilities these things. So your contract should cover the verification and decommission of safety features, stating that they have to do those things and when they have to do them. Notification, reporting and investigations of suspect falsified medical products. So how is the reporting, notification and investigation of suspect products carried out? Handling and processing of returns. Once again, how's that done within the context of the EU FMD? Handling of medicinal products destined for export, so the decommissioning and how that is done. And finally, all the record keeping to do with those activities. Your contract with your designated wholesalers should cover those things. If it doesn't, then during a GDP inspection, you may receive some type of observation. And then, of course, your designated wholesaler may not stand the tests. The final thing is that include designated wholesaler training in your EFMD training materials as part of your quality management system. Hopefully at the end of this training, you've got a much better understanding of these things, but many people in your organisation won't have, and they will need to understand this. So make sure that you've built that into your QMS and your training. Okay, so they're the recommended actions to follow up on. As I said at the beginning, we're going to do a complete 360 and just review what we've covered and look at those questions and check that you can answer them now. So the first thing, what is a designated wholesaler? Well, we know that the answer lays in Article 20, and we saw a flow that illustrated that. We know that typically they're pre-wholesalers, distributors and third-party logistics providers to the manufacturer. That's who they typically are. And they can include co-promoters. We've seen how to do that. Why are they needed? Well, they're needed to prevent unnecessary verification downstream. And we've seen the high costs and the bottlenecks that can introduce if they're not put in the master data and wholesalers are not aware of when they need to carry out risk-based verification. How they impact on an OB? Well, we know that it impacts your master data and your data maintenance processes, but just as importantly, it impacts the contracts that you have in place with your partners and the processes that you operate with those partners. And finally, it must be within your training and education material so that this can be kept up to date. And then we look to what to do next. And if you remember, document your organisation's rationale for allocating the DW status. Review your master data and check that it's fully complete. Chances are that you may have completed some of the data, but you're missing some of the parties in there. Go and check all your contracts and make sure that they meet the tests that I've shown you. And confirm your data maintenance processes are in place and there's training to cover DWs. With that, this completes the training on the DWs, and hopefully you found that interesting. Thank you very much.